Hi, my name is Shelby Redfield Kilgore, and I am the filmmaker of all of these foster care and adoption videos. To those of you who continue to keep coming to my channel and watching my videos, I am incredibly thankful. And any newcomers, thank you for clicking on this video, and I hope you will stick around on this series, Adoption Education. And in the meantime, I hope you will check out my other videos that I filmed since 2012. It's a passion project of mine, as I am a Korean adoptee, and it's just on my heart to help tell other people's stories about foster care and adoption. Today on Adoption Education, I am going to be answering the question, what is open adoption? In this episode, I'm going to be giving a brief description of what open adoption is, sharing my own personal experiences growing up in a closed adoption. And because I didn't grow up in an open adoption, I have a guest speaker on this episode today to share her own experiences about growing up in that sort of environment. To give a brief history of open adoption, it actually started to surface again in the 1970s, like late 1970s, because during the 1940s to the 1970s, which is also referred to as the baby scoop era, where women who were single and pregnant were coerced into relinquishing their baby for adoption. And because of the secrecy and the shame surrounding this, a lot of families were told to raise their child and not tell them that they are adopted. And the experts at the time felt that it would help the child, or be better for the child, because they would grow up not knowing and not feeling like they were less than because they weren't biologically related to their parents. And so this was sort of the norm for a lot of adoptive families, to be closed adoptions, and most of them not even share with their children that they are adopted. And what happened prior to that, in most cases for the adoptions, there was some degree of openness, but it shifted in the 1940s to the 1970s, and then as adoptees were finding out that they were adopted in their adult years, and the trauma and the grief and the identity issues, just the idea of being lied to for their whole entire life, the experts realized how harmful that was, and that open adoption, if it's safe for the child, is recommended because of what they were seeing as the adult adoptees who grew up in a closed adoption, and also being a late discovery adoptee and the harm from growing up in that way. As an adoptee who grew up in a closed adoption, I remember as little as 5 or 6 years old, just really wanting a picture of my first mother. I wanted so desperately to know what she looked like, what her personality was like, if we shared some of the same interests and talents. I wanted to know what features I had that I got from her. Growing up as a Korean adoptee with white parents, you don't have those genetic mirrors. And I remember just wanting so much to know who I looked like. I wanted to know if she loved me, my first mother. I think at the time growing up, all I thought about was my first mother. I really didn't think about my first father, or if I had siblings or my uncles and aunts or grandparents, like none of that. My focus was just on my first mother. And I, since I didn't know if she loved me, even though my parents told me that, I still doubted it because I didn't have that confirmation from her. And doubting that made me feel like I had a hole in my heart. It made me feel less than. It made me, so then I struggled with self-worth. I struggled with identity issues. I struggled with separation anxiety. I struggled with a deep fear of rejection. And had I had that information when I was younger, growing up and having all those years and the support of my parents, it would have really helped make a difference, I think, in feeling whole, not feeling like I was missing something. But that's, how I look at it as an adult and reflecting on it. Had I known that information, I'm not quite sure if I would feel the way I think I would. And so because I can't say for sure, I am so excited to introduce Tiffany, a domestic transracial adoptee. I connected with her on social media, and I absolutely love the work that she does. She is a writer and influencer, and you can follow her at Calling in the Wilderness, and she is the founder of Adoptee Influencer Network.
My name is Tiffany Henness. I started the Adoptee Influencer Network in 2020. I'm a writer and a creative. Right now I live in Oregon with my husband and 2 children. And I'm an infant adoptee. I was adopted the day I was born in an open, domestic, private adoption. My earliest memories that I can think back on are memories of my adoptive mom telling me things about my adoption or what it means to be adopted. And she had a very careful and kind way of talking about my being adopted, but I felt uncomfortable, not because my adoptive mom was necessarily doing anything wrong, but because I think understanding what she was saying made me different. And feeling uncomfortable, feeling like I needed to respond in a way that showed I was okay, because I felt fine. But I think I was reading or picking up on a vibe that maybe my adoptive mom thought I might not be fine with this information. And I wanted to reassure her that I'm good. This doesn't affect me much. My adoption was open from the very beginning because technically my first mom was a distant relative by marriage of the family that adopted me. So they didn't know each other very much prior, but there was always a distant family connection that tied them together. I thought about my first mom. I was curious, but I think as a really little kid, I think it just seemed so distant. The idea that I had another mother out there who I'd never met just seemed like it was not an immediate concern of mine. I had friends to play with, things to go do. And so thinking about adoption was not on the forefront of my mind a lot, but it was something that when I did think about it, I had big questions, but I didn't know how to articulate them. I met my first mom when I was about 10 or 11, I think. My, adoptive mom, and her had been communicating, and she said, I think that she's ready. And so she came to visit us, and I was just a ball of conflicting emotions that I couldn't even distinguish from one another, and even now can't really articulate all the things I was thinking and feeling. It was just overwhelming. I believe I had a sense for wanting to have a really good first impression, wanting her to think that I was good and happy and fine, and wanting my adoptive parents to think that I really enjoyed this and that it was a good thing that they set this visit up. And seeing her for the first time was interesting. I had seen photos of her when she was a kid, so I knew that she was going to be blonde-haired and blue-eyed. And in she walks, very bright blonde hair, tall, blue-eyed. And I didn't really see myself in her. She was beautiful and she was nice, but I was supposed to have this connection with her, I thought, but I didn't see myself in her. And I didn't know what to make of that. I didn't know, it's still hard to articulate how seeing someone who is your biological mother and yet looks so different from you when you've not been raised with her. What does it mean to be her child, right? What does it mean to have been born from her? I couldn't articulate it as a kid. I wouldn't have been able to have said that this confused me, but it definitely confused me with my racial and ethnic identity. And so I was excited for the attention. I was excited for somebody who wanted to get to know me and play the games I wanted to play and eat the food I wanted to eat. I think I really suppressed any emotions that were conflicting. I think I didn't know how to acknowledge the frustration of not feeling like I looked like my own mom. I think I just kind of locked it away because I didn't know how to deal with it and I didn't know how to talk about it or bring it up. And I felt like if I didn't bring up anything complicated or weird or unpleasant, then everybody else was going to be a lot happier and everybody else was going to feel like this was a good thing. And I just wanted things to be easy and I wanted to just be able to have fun and be a kid. My adoptive parents, being older and more established than my first mom, definitely, saw her as a younger woman who was in the process of getting her life together. Overwhelmingly, they spoke about her in a positive way to me. And I think they really tried to instill a positive sense for who she was in me. That being said, comments were made with no ill intention, but comments were made sometimes about my first mom's competitive, drive or her rough around the edges personality sometimes, or how she wasn't really as nurturing as a mom. After she had me, she had 3 other children. She got married and had 3 other children. And so comment sometimes here and there, I recall hearing that her mothering style was a lot less, nurturing and mothering. And she was a little bit more firm with her kids. And I think hearing that gave me the opportunity to say to myself, it's a good thing that I was adopted to a family that could love me well. And I don't think that was a conscious thought on my part, and I don't think those comments were intentional on my parents' part, but I do think they gave me an opportunity or a reason to believe that I was better off not having been raised by her. I think it set up a bit of a divide in my head, that it was going to be harder to relate to her, that it was going to be harder to connect with her. And perhaps that some of the things in my personality that were more gruff or competitive were negative things. So while on the whole, I believe that my adoptive parents communicated positive things about my first mom, there are always those small things in my kid's head that I kind of took in a wrong direction or in a bad direction. And even now, I think some of those things are at the root of why I struggle feeling like I can really reach out and connect with my first mom. So, of course, when I was a minor living with my adoptive family, they were the ones who coordinated and orchestrated everything. I saw my first mom probably a handful of times, and I was very passive, I think I may have even appeared somewhat indifferent about seeing her. Yet my adoptive mom would contact her and they would come visit in the summer, spend a day or two. Of course, at some point, I became an adult and connected with my first mom on Facebook. We kind of kept tabs on each other, just, pictures about life and what was going on. It took me a long time to realize as an adult, I can make my own schedule now. I can go and visit whomever I wish or ask my first mom to come visit me. I don't need to wait for someone else to organize that for me. I don't need permission. And it was when she came to visit after my first kid was born that I realized My relationship with her is on our own terms now. It's between her and I. It no longer involves my adoptive parents. And that's okay, and that's fine. And even though I recognize that, it still has taken me a few years to really understand that I need to take more initiative and ownership in reaching out to her, in maintaining that relationship. I think what has held me back is the sense that I'm not supposed to, or I'm not supposed to need to. And that's an odd thing to say because I know that's not true. There's a deeply seated belief in me somewhere that says, if you reach out to her, you're going to be imposing, and you shouldn't need to. Growing up, my family talked about adoption a lot, just in really shallow ways. So it was sort of known that I was adopted, and if people had questions about our family, we would just talk about that. Yeah, she's adopted, and here's the story. But there wasn't deep conversations on adoption. It wasn't like, really getting into how I felt or the complexities of what that meant for me. At least I can't recall them. So maybe I've just blocked them out because they were really uncomfortable for me. I don't know, but I think that as a kid, I really resisted the notion that being adopted had an impact on my life or who I was. It was a time-limited event that happened the day I was born. It took me a long time, actually, to realize that's not true, that being adopted plays a very active role in my life and always will. I wouldn't say that we had deep conversations on adoption, probably because either one, my parents didn't know how to invite me into those more complex conversations, or two, I just wasn't ready to have them, and I resisted the idea that there was anything more to talk about. I feel like adoption agencies and a lot of adoptive parents see open adoption as being, adoption 2.0. We've made improvements on all the things that we've been doing wrong for the past 50, 60 years. And now we have the best version of adoption. It's open adoption. And I think really what that is putting a Band-Aid on the wound. I think that's trying to improve something that you can only do so much. The deep issue is still there. A child was removed from their biological family. Even in the best case scenario, which I think a lot of times my adoption kind of is a best case scenario adoption because it was open, it was private. I think it's likely that there was a minimal amount of coercion. I'm not going to say that with confidence there was none, but there are so many things about my adoption story and circumstance that a lot of people would look at and say, see, that's how it should be done. And yet, I think that's part of the problem. When open adoption is seen as this fix-all, or it's seen as the best way to do it, what does that do to the adoptee, right? So I grew up really believing like I've gotten the best. I should be grateful. I should not complain. If I say that I still struggle with my adoption, with being disconnected from my heritage, with all of these things, it's even harder for people to believe me. If anything, being in an open adoption gives the adoptee even less room to be like, hey, this sucks, actually. Because it's still adoption, because it's still family separation, because it still makes me live a life of implications being an adoptee that I had no choice over. Overwhelmingly, you'll hear adoption agencies and people who want to adopt say that they're doing this for the kids who need permanency, the kids who need a home. But the thing is we already have a way to care for kids like that that's not adopting them. We have other legal pathways like legal guardianship. Adoption is inherently a traumatic thing because it means family separation. There's no getting around that. So instead of trying to improve the experience for the adoptee as much as possible, and open adoption is kind of what we think is the best experience of being an adoptee. In many ways, a legal guardianship looks a lot like an open adoption, but in some states, legal guardianship means the court or a judge or an organization is still checking up to be sure that that child is being cared for the way they need to by their legal guardians. With adoption, that's not the case. As soon as a child is adopted, they are legally the child of the parents who adopted them, and they could go home to an abusive adoptive family and nobody is checking up on them. The adoptive family isn't responsible to report to anyone. As a kid, I never felt like I was missing anything. I had a strong desire to see my life as being great and complete and whole. I often said that I didn't need to know anything about my biological father because my adoptive father was so great and he was enough for me, and why would I even need that? I think a lot of times, without realizing it, I said that because I was trying to make it true, right? I didn't allow myself to be curious. I didn't allow myself to consider what it might mean to me to have more information or to have a connection with my Chinese heritage, or to see my first mom more or have more interaction with her. I just knew it was uncomfortable because it was different, and I wanted to avoid the discomfort as much as possible. And I wanted to just show everybody that I was having a really good life and I was really thankful and everything was fine for me. So no, as a kid, I never felt like I was missing anything. And yet now, as a 30-something with kids of my own, I definitely feel like I missed out on a lot and definitely wish that things had been different. I would tell adoptive families who have an open adoption that two things are true at once, even though they seem like they oppose each other. The first is that you do know your child best. You've been raising them. You spend the most time with them. But it's also true that there are things they are saying and doing that they don't even recognize are masking or suppressing or come from an inability for the child to even recognize what they're struggling with. And so while you might know them the best, it is still possible that 20 or 30 years later, your adopted kid is going to come to you now as an adult and be like, hey, I have revisited my childhood and feel very differently now. And I was conflicted with things that I wasn't able to tell you when I was a kid, but those things were there all along. And so my advice to adoptive parents is to welcome that really hard to swallow information, to be prepared to sit with your adult adopted child and grieve with them over things that they weren't even able to recognize when they were a kid, or listen to them when they might come to you and say, you know I grew up saying that this was fine and everything was good, but I don't feel that way now, and I don't think I really feel that way then. I just felt like I was supposed to. I don't think adoptive parents in open adoptions are really prepared for that. Some of the adoptive parents who are in open adoptions that I've talked to, I really appreciate their heart behind the open adoption and their intent to facilitate really good relationships with the first families. But what concerns me, I guess, is just seeing their conviction that they're doing the right thing and that this means that their experience for their kid is going to be better. And I don't actually know that that's true. My personal experience tells me that that's not true. Open adoption does not make it any less hard for an adoptee whenever we go through realizing the struggles, confronting the issues that we have. I want adoptive parents in open adoptions to be prepared for that, to not think that because it was open, because they facilitated a relationship with their child's first family, that they somehow aren't going to have XYZ issues. Sometimes being an adoptee in an open adoption means I just now have two sets of parents, two moms that I can disappoint. Now I have two moms that I need to prove they did the right thing for me. In my open adoption, I think there was a lot more of a sense on my part that people were watching me, my first mom included, and I needed to show everybody that I was okay. I needed to show everybody that they'd done the right thing. I didn't want them to feel bad. Open adoption means that if I express an issue like I wish I had more access to my Chinese heritage, or I wish that I would have seen my first mom more, that those things are my fault because the adoption was open and I did have access. I just should have asked for it. Or I could have seen my first mom more, but I wasn't showing that I wanted to. And therefore, it's not because it was closed that I didn't get to see her. It was because my adoptive parents were following my lead, and that's why I didn't see her as much. Or that's why they didn't help me find my Chinese family, because I didn't ask. And so to me, that's the struggle with open adoption, is that if I do express some of those things in my head, I can hear how, well, you could have, you just should have asked. And so now it's my fault as the kid, because, I didn't express that. I didn't advocate for myself at 12 years old that I wanted to have these things, because if I had, they would have done it, right? And that's kind of a really horrible thing to sit with. There were a lot of reasons why I felt I couldn't or shouldn't articulate those things when I was younger, or I didn't even know that those things would have been important to me. It's become really important to me as an adult now that I realize my experience of being adopted is so much more complex and so misunderstood, even amongst my own family. And so the Adoptee Influencer Network really came out of a passion for wanting to drive more people's attention toward adoptees who are already writing and sharing their stories. Adoptee voices are out there. They're just getting drowned out by all of the other adoption content that's put out by agencies or parents or organizations. It's time to do something about that. And the Adoptee Influencer Network, it's like this slow burning project and passion of mine. And really wanting to share adoptee stories in a way that helps show the complexity. I mean, every adoptee's experience is distinct. We are just as different as we are alike. In my mind, the more adoptee voices that are out there, the better. Even if they are adoptees who have different perspectives than I do, or believe different things than I do, I still think it's valuable for the adoptee's voice and perspective to be out there and to be centered, because really, we've not been listened to historically, and on the whole, even now, we're considered sort of interesting anecdotal information, but the world at large is ignoring adoptee voices when it comes to understanding adoption, family preservation, how to really help families in crisis. So in another life, I was a fitness coach, and I created my Instagram account when I was Coach Henness, a certified personal trainer and marathon running coach. And but that's where you can find me on Instagram, is at Coach Henness. My blog is callinginthewilderness.com, and so I have a Facebook page also by that same name. My personal writing is really a lot about adoption, religion, and ethnic identity, and the intersection of those things. Just like with anything in adoption, open adoption is going to mean something different, probably to every adoptee who has an open adoption. No two instances are 100% alike, but I would say overwhelmingly, the commonalities that I see with others who are in open adoption is just the disenfranchised grief that we can sometimes have, and the reminder that even though it's open, we were still separated, and there's still trauma that needs to be acknowledged and respected. There's still grief, there's still loss.